Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and highly relevant piece from The Economist. And it's about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the BBB. This is that major tax and spending plan that's, lurching through Congress right now. And it really does have this chimerical feel, sort of blending economic ideas that seem poles apart. Our mission today isn't just to summarize it. We want to offer a more critical interpretation, really explore the core arguments, maybe challenge some assumptions, and look at the wider implications using some interesting background material we've gathered.
Indeed. And this bill, it's not just complicated, it's actually quite a masterclass in modern political economy. It reveals layers of thinking you might miss just reading the headlines. We're going to look at what The Economist calls its hollowness, sure, but also add some layers of nuance that, the original piece couldn't fully get into. Think about how it passed the Senate, razor-thin margin, 51-50. VP Vance had to break the tie. That was just July 1st. And already you've got fiscal hawks in the House making noise about revisions. So it's not just promises. It really shines a light on the economic and political tensions right now. It's quite profound, actually.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So the Economist article, it frames the BBB as chimera economics, like a matchup of things that don't seem to fit together, Reagan-style tax cuts, Trumpian populism, even specific earmarks. Their main point seems to be it's fiscally irresponsible, set to blow a multi-trillion-dollar hole in the budget. And they also focus on how the benefits are distributed, suggesting it's regressive. Wealthy households win big, while programs like Medicaid, climate initiatives. They seem to lose out. They even call it ephemeral Trumpism, kind of implying it's just warmed over 2017 GOP ideas, not really a coherent new doctrine.
Right. And that narrative, it sounds pretty convincing on the surface, but it does rest on some assumptions that, you can contest when you look a bit closer at how the bill is actually put together. For instance, The Economist says Trumponomics lacks ideology, paints it as just a jumble of ideas. But our sources suggest there is an implicit ideology here, something you might call security state capitalism. It suggests a deliberate strategy. You see, the bill connects major tax cuts directly to this huge $300 billion plus surge in spending, specifically on border security and defense. So if you look at it through that lens, the cuts, say, to Medicaid or rolling back climate rules, they don't look like random add-ons. They actually look like features. They're designed quite specifically to free up federal money. And that money gets channeled straight into defense, into funding deportations. It's basically prioritizing national security supply chains, border enforcement, maybe over traditional small government ideas.
Oh, okay. So if I'm getting this right, what looks messy is maybe actually a deliberate strategy. Funding national security by cutting elsewhere and finding new revenue. This security state capitalist idea. That definitely reframes it. Speaking of funding, The Economist really hits the White House on its growth fantasy, saying they're relying on these, hard-to-believe supply-side effects from the tax cuts. But you're saying the math also banks on something totally different, something voters maybe don't see directly.
Precisely. It counts very heavily on tariffs. We've seen these big hikes recently, especially back in June. Average U.S. tariff rates are now up between 15% and 15.6%. I mean, historically, that's the highest they've been since 1938. Now, these tariffs, they're projected to bring in something like $1 trillion over 10 years. That is a huge chunk of money, almost a third of what the White House claims will offset the bill's costs. So this raises a really critical question, a vulnerability maybe. What happens if the courts strike down the emergency powers doctrine? Because that's what was used for a lot of these tariffs. If that legal challenge works and those tariffs get rolled back, that fiscal hole could get much, much bigger very quickly. It really undermines a big part of their revenue claim.
Okay, let's pivot to the human and environmental costs. The article is pretty blunt here. It says Medicaid cuts are simply cruel. They estimate anywhere from, 11 to 17 million people could lose insurance, with 12 million of those just from Medicaid. And the bill brings in these community engagement requirements, but basically work requirements, plus states have to reassess eligibility every 6 months. It sounds like a recipe for chaos for people.
Well, the human cost of losing coverage on that scale, it's undeniably severe. But it's also really important to look at the mechanism here and what past attempts tell us. We've seen these work requirement pilots before, right, in places like Arkansas and Montana. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, audited them. And what they found was, caseloads dropped significantly, 15-25%. But the number of people actually nudge it into jobs, barely 1%. So what does that suggest? It strongly points to the design being less about getting people working and much more about, pruning the budget, cutting costs by cutting people off benefits. And on top of that, The bill pushes the admin costs for these frequent checks onto the states, many of them red states. This is already sparking lawsuits, very similar to the challenges we saw against the Obama-era Medicaid expansion. It feels like a calculated move focused much more on the fiscal side than employment.
And the green rollbacks, the article calls it ideological backsliding.
Yeah.
I mean, the BBB basically scraps hundreds of billions in green subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act. Tax credits for wind and solar, EVs gone. Reinstating oil and gas leasing. Sources are suggesting this could boost CO2 emissions by, 350 to 500 million metric tons by 2030. That's a huge swing backwards.
It absolutely is an ideological rollback, no question. And the climate impact is very real. But what's also fascinating, and maybe less obvious, is that while it is ideological, it's also acting as a kind of tariff shield. That gives you some insight into the internal logic. See, by getting rid of the domestic EV credits and bringing back oil leasing, it actually helps the administration defend its 25% tariffs on imported cars at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. They can argue it's consumer neutral. Like, look, we're not unfairly favoring EVs with the subsidies while taxing imported gas cars. We're removing the EV help, too. It makes it harder for other countries to claim the tariffs are purely protectionist. So yeah, the climate cost is massive. But there's this quite shrewd, maybe even cynical trade angle that helps explain the internal GOP thinking. It ties climate and trade policy together.
That is a fascinating insight. Almost cynical, like you said. So it's not just anti-green energy. It's a calculated move to protect trade policies. That link is key. Okay, let's talk fiscal implications. The Economist warns about a deficit blowout, saying it shows hypocrisy. Preliminary estimates for the Senate bill adding something like $4.6 trillion to deficits over 10 years, pushing the debt-to-GDP ratio potentially over 120%. I mean, with numbers like that, shouldn't the markets be freaking out?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? If you look at the bigger picture, such a huge jump in projected debt, you'd expect a strong market reaction. But, kind of surprisingly, they haven't really blinked yet. 10-year Treasury yields, basically the government's borrowing cost for a decade, a key indicator, they're sitting flat around 4.4%. It seems like investors are maybe pricing in future actions, perhaps anticipating some kind of entitlement reform down the road, maybe after 2030 when the Social Security and Medicare trust funds are projected to run low. Whether that complacency holds? That's a big open question, a critical one. The article treats the deficit jump as a definite crisis that should be alarming markets now. It maybe overlooks this rather calm market behavior and what investors might be assuming about future politics. It's a gamble the market seems willing to take, for now anyway.
And then you have the White House claims, BBB adding over a point to annual GDP growth, trillions in deficit reduction offsets. That sounds, well, the phrase fiscal fantasy land comes to mind.
Indeed. The Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA, their predictions?
Yeah, they're widely seen as, let's say, preposterous by most independent analysts. Several reasons. First, the bill is mostly just continuing existing policies. You don't usually get a massive new growth surge just by extending things. Second, the assumptions they make about deregulation boosting the economy or Congress suddenly finding the will to slash spending, they just seem to contradict what's actually happening, the political reality. And crucially, like we talked about, it relies so heavily on those tariffs bringing in trillions, which, again, are legally shaky if the courts challenge the emergency powers. The basic math just doesn't really add up for most nonpartisan forecasters. So beyond the numbers, the immediate impacts. Our sources point to these bigger strategic tensions, things the article might not fully capture but could really shape things for years to come.
Absolutely, and that this gets into some really important questions about the bill's long-term trajectory. It reveals these deep kind of hidden fault lines in politics and economics right now. Take the tension between security and sustainability. You've got this projected debt path heading towards 120% of GDP that's enormous, but it slams right into a Pentagon budget that's set to grow 4% in real terms each year. Sooner or later, especially for Republicans who traditionally talk about fiscal responsibility and strong defense, they're going to face a really hard choice. Is it guns or is it tax cuts? You probably can't sustain both indefinitely on that debt path.
Right.
Another fault line, populist optics versus the, well, regressive math underneath. Think about that tax-free tips and overtime thing. Sounds populist, right? But it expires in 2029. Meanwhile, things like SALT relief, which mostly helps higher earners in blue states and changes to the estate tax, those are permanent.
Yeah.
You can bet that Magier influencers, maybe potential 2028 candidates, they're going to hammer that point when those temporary benefits run out and the permanent ones for the wealthy stick around. That disparity will be a target.
And what about the state's role in this? Especially with Medicaid.
Well, making states recertify Medicaid eligibility every 6 months, that pushes huge administrative costs onto them. Many are conservative states. They'll face a choice: bear those costs, or see residents lose coverage. This is already setting up legal fights, just like we saw with the ACA Medicaid expansion. It's that persistent federal-state tension flaring up again. And then there's the international angle, climate politics abroad. The EU is already pointing to the repeal of those Section 45 clean energy provisions here as a reason they might impose retaliatory carbon tariffs, taxing imports based on their carbon footprint. That kind of trade friction could easily wipe out any short-term GDP bump the bill hopes to get from boosting domestic fossil fuels. It could turn into a major trade headache.
So pulling this all together, what does it really mean? How should we think about the BBB considering all this nuance, the critical take, these bigger tensions?
Well, The Economist is definitely right that the BBB exposes contradictions in modern Republican economics, no doubt about that. But maybe it's less a random, chaotic chimera and more accurately seen as a kind of security-obsessed, debt-deferring bargain. That's maybe the key takeaway here. Essentially, it keeps taxes relatively low for voters, lets corporations write off investments, and then it figures out how to pay for it. How? Through those legally iffy tariffs, through making Medicaid harder to keep that paperwork burden, and by spending a lot more on the Pentagon. It's a very specific strategic mix, not just random policies thrown together. It aims for certain national security goals, certain economic outcomes, while pushing the really tough fiscal decisions off into the future.
Right. So ultimately, it extends the 2017 tax cuts, fiddles with social spending, boosting some, cutting others, and definitely gears up the state for immigration enforcement and great power competition. It really does feel like a bridge bill, as you said. Just punting the hard choices on entitlements, on how to really pay for things, on climate, punting it all to the next administration.
Exactly. And whether that bridge holds up or collapses under its own weight, that depends on several really key things unfolding. First, the courts. What happens with those tariffs? If they get struck down, that's potentially $1 trillion hole. Second, the bond market. Does its patience run out? Just a small rise in real interest rates, maybe 60 basis points, just over 0.5%, could wipe out all the growth effects the bill predicts within just 3 years. Third, the states. Will they successfully push back on the Medicaid rules? If they do, those projected savings could vanish, making the deficit even worse. And finally, global reaction. Will we see those carbon tariffs or digital levies from the EU or Asia that can neutralize any export benefits the bill's backers are hoping for? So the gamble of this security-obsessed, debt-deferring bargain, it won't be decided by mythology or spin. It's going to come down to courts, capital markets, and climate diplomacy, probably all playing out over the next 18 months or so. What stands out to you when you consider these factors?